Good evening, Flagstaff, Arizona, uh, wherever you are. Good evening, LBE family. It's good to see you back again this evening. Tonight, we're bringing another, I think it's a hot topic, but this is just one of our bi-weekly discussions on Jim Crow and the private prison system. I'm really excited about this evening's conversation. I am from the Dirty South, where Jim Crow was definitely one of those southern states where those laws were enforced, and traveling throughout Georgia as a college recruiter for an HBCU, Savannah State University. I had the experience of going to many small towns that still had the for coloreds only signs over water fountains in restaurants. And this was in the 90s. Into the early 2000s. So Jim Crow, depending on where you live, is still very much in effect. And even if the signs aren't there, the sentiment remains in some, or if not most, of our southern states. Very happy to have our resident facilitator here in the house, Sister Kara House, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Bernadine, and welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening. We're going to launch right into our presentations and start with the history of Jim Crow. And giving that presentation is Mr. Jesse Brookins. Jesse Brookins holds a Master of Arts in Applied Sociology from Northern Arizona University. Mr. Brookins previously served as a graduate TA for Ethnic Studies for NAU's Inclusion and Multicultural Student Services, and as a member of Golden Brown, a Black men's social equity and advocacy organization in Flagstaff. Mr. Brookins currently works as a trainer and facilitator for the National Conflict Resolution Center, creating safe spaces for open dialogue with the goal of contributing to more diverse and inclusive communities. Welcome, Mr. Brookins.
Thank you for having me. And as you can see on the screen, I'm just going to kind of jump into it. I wanted to start by sharing, quotes from very prominent figures, that we look up to as far as influence and impact for progression in Black community. Starting off with James Baldwin, who says, "The story of the Negro in America is the story of America, and it's not a pretty story," right? And I wanted to lay that kind of foundation of where we're coming from, because we understand the Jim Crow laws, but sometimes we don't always look at what led up to those moments of that intense hatred, right? Next slide that I want to show you is with Frederick Douglass, who says, "I appear this evening as a thief and robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master and ran off with them." And I found this quote to be extremely profound, because when you think about it, any action and any effort that Black people and minorities in general have fought for towards liberation has been seen as an act of crime and deviance within the eyes of our Constitution and our nation as a whole. And I think that's a good framework to expect to look and view, the system of Jim Crow that it was. But when we first start, where did Jim Crow come from? Where did the name come from? Right? So the origin of Jim Crow was actually rooted in a minstrel caricature and character. Throughout the early 1830s and 1840s, what was a failed entertainer by the name of Thomas Dartmouth Rice found his new steam, right, in supposedly impersonating slaves who were crippled and spoke differently. So he found a new way of gaining attraction and an audience by putting himself in blackface and pretending to be a Black individual by exaggerating the characteristics. You saw this in the way that he exaggerated his walk. You can see in the pictures how he moves very awkwardly, and his mockery of Black vernacular was very exaggerated. And this resulted in not only the increase in his career, but also a bunch of influences as many other people started to take on the form of Jim Crow as an entertainment purpose and spreading the misinformation of what Black people truly were through stereotyping and the mischaracterization of our existence, further pushing this theory and belief of inferiority or Blackness being inferior, and therefore reaffirming the ideology of white supremacy. Now, this term is then, as we all know, was embodied within the term of Jim Crow laws. So this is where that term is truly rooted in and where it came from. Now, to go further in a little bit of some legalities, it's important to understand cases that had very important impact on the progression which led to Jim Crow itself. Particularly when we look at the Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott was once enslaved, and he had freed himself by escaping to Northern Territory where there was freedom. After spending years there, he then returned to Missouri, where he was previously enslaved, and filed a lawsuit against his master, saying that now that he is free, that they cannot no longer hold him in bondage. The Supreme Court ultimately upheld that as follows: a Negro whose ancestors were imported from the U.S. and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore did not have standing to sue in federal court. They also said that slaves were property under the Fifth Amendment and that any law that would deprive a slave owner of that property is unconstitutional. So this is important to realize and understand as a framework of the case, seeing that whether enslaved or not, the Negro, because he was descendant of someone who was enslaved, had no rights within the Constitution and within political participation that is afforded to all people, and which it's supposed to be, right? So this is a big and pivotal moment within our history and showing that framework. As we move forward, we look at Juneteenth. Now, I know in Flagstaff and of course across all the country, Black people, as they should, proudly celebrate Juneteenth, which is the last day that all of Black people who were enslaved were in fact freed. But this resulted in a rebuttal from many white supremacists who sought to reclaim their order, right? So after failed Confederate soldiers lost the Civil War, they then started to fight for positions within the courts, whether it be through law enforcement, as being a judge, or otherwise. They fought for positions of being jurors to push these acts, particularly Black codes and the Vagrancy Act of 1866, which criminalized any Black person who did not have employment at that time or lodging, especially during working hours, which resulted in them being arrested and then put back in chains and sold within convict leasing programs to the very same plantations that they were enslaved at. So this is the process and the mind frame that has been set and established for putting, quote unquote, Black people back into their place, right? This mission to put them under the control of a system that has sought to oppress them from the very beginning. Then in 1875, not everyone knows this because it's not always publicized, unfortunately. But when you look at 1875, there was a Civil Rights Act that was passed. And the Congress passed this, which prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, including inns, theaters, public conveyances, land, water, etc. Right? So this was passed because under the law, under the 14th Amendment, right, they acknowledged that it was wrong to mistreat and discriminate against people that you may not like, based upon the color of their skin. However, just as it came, so it went. In 1883, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the civil rights case of 1875 that it was unconstitutional, right? This passing was unconstitutional. The court ruled that the 14th Amendment prohibited states, but not citizens, from discriminating. And that's important. They said states, but not citizens. And the citizens are a representation of the entirety of the state. So there is clearly a contradiction that is existing within that rhetoric that they failed or did not want to see, which further impacted Black people, which leads us to, most importantly, May 18th, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a situation in which Homer Plessy on the left was participating in public transportation, and there was a no colored section in which he chose to sit down in. Now, as a result, he was arrested, and then he filed the suit claiming that, again, under the 14th Amendment, one cannot discriminate by the state, which is public transportation upheld by the state, right? That you can discriminate. But the Supreme Court established the separate but equal rhetoric in the doctrine, which held that racial segregation does not violate equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, which is the groundwork and the framework of what Jim Crow is. They created this loophole rhetoric of, as long as we keep it separate, and we supply the same product, right? It's not a form of discrimination. However, it is in fact still very much a form of discrimination, because what quality, as we know, and now have we seen in hindsight, what quality of that product is being provided for Black people as opposed to being provided for their white counterpart? So this act in itself resulted in laws being set in place. Now, coming from a sociological background, I decided to frame this within the terminology of de jure, right? So de jure meaning by law. They started to implement and use their constitutional leverage and their political participation to enforce discrimination amongst Black people and people of color in general. So when you look at these pictures, you see, as you heard before with Ms. Bernadine, you see how in the buses, colored seats were very apparent. The separation with water fountains was very apparent and enforced even, because now that the Constitution, now that the government and the systems itself are upholding this rhetoric of separation and segregation, it now fueled the community further to enact this reality, right? So you see how they do that with the fountains. And at the bottom left, you see the difference in quality of a school that is given and promoted for colored and Black people of that time versus white people and their schools, and how much bigger and how much more resources were provided as a result. Another thing that's important to realize is during this time, particularly between 1890 and around 1910, is when the southern states started inflicting harsher rules and prerequisites for voting rights. So when we talk about the literacy tests that prevented access to Black people having the right to politically participate, this was a big aspect of it. So de jure, meaning by law, these are how they sought to control their narrative and to control Black bodies. For the next term, I'm referring to de facto, which is by practice or by cultural practice. An important aspect when you think about regarding cultural aspect is pop culture, popular culture, which was the media and still is the media to this day. One of the most prominent films during that time was The Birth of a Nation, which falls under the same rhetoric of a hero story, which means for there to be a hero, there must be a villain. And in this movie, the villain happened to be Black people post-Civil War. Once all of people who were enslaved Black people who were enslaved were freed. Now, this resulted in the movie, right, in their mind frame, their twisted mind frame. This resulted in Black people acting out savagely and ravaging the earth, pillaging the earth, and abusing their freedom, right, by taking away the purity of their white women, right? And who was going to stop this? Who was going to set the world back in order or create that balance? And that was the heroic role of the Ku Klux Klan, right? So the Ku Klux Klan and the initiation or creation of the Ku Klux Klan within this movie sought to show that they were doing, God's work, essentially, that they were being the heroes of the time. And by killing and arresting and putting the Black savages, right, back into their place, they were restoring order to America, right? Making America great again, right? That's the narrative. And it was a huge hit. To be surprised, it was a huge hit during that time. And even won a few film awards that we see today. So this I'm referring to is painting that image and using media platforms by cultural practice, to reframe and reinforce that narrative of Black criminality and Black inferiority, right, compared to the white counterpart. And then if you look at the top right corner, I also referenced this map of redlining, particularly with the housing and how they disproportionately provided opportunity for housing. And by that, the redlining specifically provided the segregated communities there. And not only that, they controlled the manner in which they would rent or allow an individual to own that house, which we all understand now, particularly with working in middle class families, that's an extreme important factor in order to develop wealth. So by preventing someone to own that property, you are continually perpetuating them in the cycle of having to answer to someone or answer to an individual. And probably the most gruesome and most important piece when we talk about de facto, particularly within Jim Crow, was the unwritten law. This is a term particularly used most famously by Ida B. Wells, who was a firm advocate for anti-lynching. She was against lynching and fought valiantly for Black people. But the unwritten law was the concept in which white mobs or white people in general, within whatever position, used the form of social control by abusing their power and using violence to keep people in their place. This was apparent within 1919, which is now referred to as the Red Summer, where throughout the South, there was many incidences in which white mobs entered Black communities and killed and murdered and brought violence. Now, in many cases, some people may try to come up with an argument, well, what did the Black people do to deserve it? Were they accused of robbing? Were they accused of this or that? In many cases, it was to set an example. A lot of the people that were lynched within this time and space were owners, were highly educated, right? Were used, or as they would like to call, uppity Negroes, right? So to lynch an individual of that high of a stature was to send a message to the rest of the Black community to once again stay in their place, wherever that place may be, right? And most notably, and most that many people are aware of, is the destruction and the massacre that happened in the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where the destruction of Black Wall Street, one of the most successful Black economic communities that has ever existed on American soil, was burned down out of accusations, but particularly out of jealousy of the ability to grow and gain that economic status, despite all the obstacles that were still in their way and that continue to be in the way of Black people to this day. Now, many of these things resulted in the Great Migration. And essentially, it's just that. within 1915, between the 1930s, particularly, Black people started to move. It was like, we're getting out of here. We're getting out of the South because they are really trying to control us through means of fear and violence. So they sought to move to the North and move to places where there will be further opportunity, which is particularly important when you think about the city of Flagstaff. And when you look at the history of lumberjacks, particularly being Black and brown communities who worked at those positions. Many of those communities and families migrated from the South all the way to Flagstaff and searched for that opportunity and searched for businesses and to create a new space. So this is a very important factor that exists even within Flagstaff itself, because you see the traces and the elements that are apparent there. But how does change get enacted, right? The change that was able to be enacted was primarily through valiant efforts of many faces. Just to name a few, when we think about people like Ella Baker, of course, Martin Luther King, Ida B. Wells, when we think about Malcolm X, people who were in the streets, and we think about SNCC, even the youth that were in the streets fighting and pushing, the late, great John Lewis, pushing and fighting for these acts because they understood that they would not be respected based upon the cultural practice of white supremacy, that there was no means for them being respected based upon that individual and interpersonal appeal, unfortunately. But they understood that through their political participation, that the same way that they've been discriminated against based upon these Jim Crow laws that have been approved and voted for and passed, that we could use and leverage that political system that wasn't meant for us. We could use those systems as a political tool to create the change needed. And these listed here within this presentation are just a few examples. So when we look in 1948, with President Harry Truman ordering integration of armies, and when we look at 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education, where it was deemed, educational segregation was unconstitutional, led by a prominent figure that is Thurgood Marshall, which brought an end to separate but equal within education, right? And to add some context about how, like, some people say, oh, back in the day, or this was, so long ago, Ruby Bridges, one of the first people to integrate a white school, is only 66 years old. That iconic figure, that picture that we have seen for centuries and centuries, or for years and years and decades, within our textbooks, Ruby Bridges is only 66 years old. So this is very much still a part of our culture. But as I continue, when we look at 1964, through the work and the efforts of Martin Luther King, the work of SNCC, Ella Baker, and all the organizers, Stokely Carmichael, who then changed his name to Kwame Ture, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights, which legally ended segregation that had been institutionalized by Jim Crow laws. And then fast forwarding to 1965, which is very important, particularly now, the Voting Rights Act, which halted the efforts to keep minorities from voting, which eliminated the literacy tests that I mentioned before, right? This was a pivotal piece because those figures, and even now, we understand how important it is to be engaged and involved with the political process and to have your voice. Because unfortunately, what we've seen time and time again for centuries now is that they will not respect you based upon the color of your skin. The only thing that they see in many cases sometimes is how you vote with your ballot. And that's the change that you can implement. That's the influence that you can have, because that vote matters. Why else would they have spent so many decades, so many years trying to keep you from having that access to vote? Because they understand the power behind it, and they understand the influence behind it, and they understand that change can be made behind it. along with the protests, along with the education and speaking and communicating with individuals, they understood that that vote and getting that passed, the Voting Rights Act passed, was pivotal and important process. And then lastly, when we look at 1968, the Fair Housing Act, which ended discrimination in renting and selling homes. So all that to say, when we look at Jim Crow and the Jim Crow laws and how it was inflicted de jure by law and then de facto culturally, we can now understand that the way that those things were changed were through our vote. And we understand that the power of our vote is very important and is a pivotal that each individual 18 years of age and older, so I'm speaking to the younger generation like myself, to be part of that process, because that's what moves us forward. That's all I have.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation, Mr. Brookins. And we'd like to remind our audience, if you have questions for him or for any of our presenters this evening, be sure to share them in the comments for our open Q&A at the end of all of our presentations this evening. Up next, we are going to hear about America's industrial prison complex. Orange is the new black incarceration in America. And this presentation is going to be given by Mr. Khalil Rushdan. Mr. Rushdan is himself an exoneree. He is the Community Partnership Coordinator for the ACLU of Arizona Campaign for Smart Justice. He is also a criminal legal consultant and mentor for several formerly incarcerated individuals. Both the legal community and the private sector look to Mr. Rushdan as a leader who brings real-time solutions. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. So I would like to start off by saying, don't fall for the illusion that there is a system who has the interests of the people to keep you safe. We're looking at a new system or the same system, but reason I say a new system, because every couple decades, it just changes its face. It puts on a new mask, puts on different makeup, changes its hairstyle. People start changing the terminology of what the system is and how they describe it. But it all leads to one thing: confinement. In other words, mass incarceration. So when we talk about this system of mass incarceration, at the base of it, and what may be a driver, is systemic racism. And I say what may be a driver because now we have a mixture. It may have solely started off as systemic racism, but at this point in time, we have a mixture of greed, of profiteering off the backs and the misery of others. So I say that because we look at systemic racism and why searching. Because people get distracted and they no longer target systemic racism to pull it up by the roots. There's people out who say, hey, there's a war against the police, or there's a war against the government, or there's a war against this. And I tell people, don't get distracted. I'm not at war against the police. However, you do have racist police in uniform. But if we keep chasing the symptoms and not digging up the roots of systemic racism in this country, then we're going to see it keep playing out over and over again from decade to decade. And we're really going to see how the next industrial prison complex is built. Because now we're starting to see where it's unpopular to confine people in majority part of the country, but then they're coming up with community alternatives to where you might have an ankle monitor, or you might be, you might have this parole. And if you're not physically confined, you will be financially confined, which is those associated with paroles and probations, where a person might be released from prison, or a person may never go to prison. However, you're on probation until you pay certain fines off. And if you don't pay those fines, then we'll physically incarcerate you. So I say all of this to say that most people probably know this, but let's get to the facts. America's criminal legal system holds about 2.3 million people. Within that system alone, there are 1,833 state prisons spread out across this country. There are 110 federal prisons. There are 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, 218 immigration detention centers. And then there's about 80 jails. That's including those that are on indigenous land or within indigenous communities across this country. I state that because when we look at the facts of what we call a criminal justice system, a lot of the people I talk to in the community remove justice from that sentence and call it a criminal legal system, simply because we have to look at how much money is associated with this system. So there was a quote that I always used to say, and when I got to thinking about what the system is, I started listening to officials. I started listening to, police officers, especially when they're trying to perpetuate fear on a community to justify confinement. They would use terms like public safety, law and order. We're seeking justice. But how those things play out is why I came up with this quote. Because public safety does not come through law and order does not equal justice. And justice will come when you can change the punitive culture to punish people. And I say that because mass incarceration is in direct conflict with all human rights and those practices. So when we look at the money involved or associated with the legal system here in this country, we're looking at $182 billion a year industry, with $80.7 billion going to public correction agencies. That's parole, jails, probation, prisons. 38.4 billion, that goes to public employees, all of those employees associated with running those systems, or excuse me, the public side of it. $2.3 billion going to healthcare. We're looking at $3.3 billion in construction, $1.9 billion in interest payments, and those for like past construction where they finance construction in certain parts of the country. $2.1 billion in food, $1.7 billion in utilities, $3.9 billion of private corrections, and that's where they've outsourced. The states have contracted with private facilities. Well, states and federal system have contracted to those private prisons. And then about 374 million goes to private prison, those profits. On the other side, judicial and legal comes out to about $29 billion a year. Prosecution offices, they get about $5.8 billion. Indigent defense, $4.5 billion. Policing, $63.2 billion. let's see here. They make about 1.6 billion on commissary and 1.3 billion on telephone calls. And I say this is a problem because we hear so many people advocating to end for-profit prisons, and they're distracted when it comes to state versus private prison. And I tell them, no, we have to snatch the covers off the state prisons because our state prisons are basically a shell because everything within those prisons are now privatized. Your phones, your medical, your food, your clothing, everything is privatized to where it's no longer in the interest of public safety. It's no longer in the interest of law and order. It's no longer in the interest of justice. It's in the interest of profits. Because all those individuals laying in those beds become consumers. They become consumers or they become labor. And most of those people within the prison are having to buy products from commissary. Some of them are even having to buy their own clothes. Some of them are forced to pay a copay for medical. And all of those who are fortunate to get a job where it should be training inside our prison system, it is no longer training, it is labor that they label as training, on-the-job training. But we start to see that most of those people released with those skills, the companies that employ them while they're in prison won't even hire them when they're released. That becomes a bigger problem because most people hear about the mass incarceration push, the criminal justice reform push, and they think that it does not apply to them in Arizona. So what I like to do is break those national numbers down to see how they play out within our state. So Arizona, the state population, prison population as of today is 38,646,000. At the beginning of this year, we were at about 43,000 individuals. Each one of those individuals costs the taxpayer about $25,000 a year. And Arizona has this is just a state prison. I'm not factoring in the jails, but just the state prison alone has 10 state prisons, and then they contract with 6 private prisons. So in other words, the state will contract and send individuals to these private prisons that are located throughout the state. Saddest thing about that, under Governor Brewer, these private prisons seem to get lucrative contracts from the taxpayer. Taxpayer was sold out because our last private prison that went online, which was Red Rock down by Eloy, we entered into a 20-year contract. And I say we because the taxpayers are on the hook for that bill. We entered into a 20-year contract with this private prison. And regardless, they get paid a 90% occupancy rate for the next 20 years. Well, we're at about 5 years now, so about the next 15 years. Taxpayers on the hook for that. So the overall system here in Arizona has went from, in 2003, the budget for just to house people was $623 million. In 2013, that budget grew to $1.1 billion. In 2020, we were at 1.2 and counting $billion. We are the 5th highest incarcerator in the nation. And even though people are saying reform, 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 people are still confined. People still have obstacles in their paths when it comes to reentry. So when we talk about a revolving door policy, Arizona releases 19,000 people each year, probably for the last 8 years, 19,000 people. But 19,000 people were going back in each year. First year recidivism rate for those released, the percentage was 21%. So 21% of that 19,000 is going back within the first year. And I think by year 4, recidivism rate was at 42.3%. And that's extremely high. So when we talk about implementing solutions, and we talk about that notion of second chance, and me being an advocate, me being someone who went through the system to understand firsthand what it took for me to not only deal with those conditions of confinement and the traumas associated with that isolation, but to come out and recognize that, learn how to heal and overcome obstacles, to be one of the foremost criminal justice and criminal legal reform persons and consultants in the state, to be a frontline advocate, to never be able to clock out. It took a lot for me to overcome that. But I had to realize one thing. I had to restore hope. Most of the people in the system, they enter. The system is meant to eliminate hope because they needed us in compliance. Compliance means control. So they had to stomp out, and I say stomp out because there's an aggressive push to have you in compliance. To those in charge of corrections, compliance means security. It means, safety within the prison to them, but it doesn't. It just means control. So what's sad about it is the fact that Arizona, as of last year, ranked 47th in the nation when it comes to per pupil spending. The school system and the spending per pupil ranks 47th in the nation. And that is a bigger problem because the work I do now with the ACLU of Arizona and with several other community orgs is we have to change that punitive culture to shift the mind state from dumping money into prison systems and start back investing in people. We look at this industrial complex, and most people say, well, it doesn't apply to me until one of their loved ones gets caught up in that web. And once they get caught up in that web, it's harder for them to get out. And on the front end of it, where we look at those policies, where any amount of marijuana, whether you agree with the legalization of it or not, any amount in the state of Arizona can get you a 2-year prison sentence. When you have mandatory minimums for those people who have substance use disorders, where the first mind state is to confine the person, and everybody knows you can't incarcerate addiction out of an individual, but then they enter this same system where there's a lack of treatment, there's a lack of programming, where people are just marinating, they finish their sentence and they come back out. most of those people have co-occurring issues now. They have the substance use, and then they have those traumas of confinement or their conditions of, coming from their conditions of confinement. So even if a person is successful with sobriety, there's so much anxiety and pressure on their back because most programs haven't dealt with the mental health side. So I say that because when we talk about solutions and we talk about applying real-time solutions, we have to address this as a community, which I like to call a village. Everybody has to come together because we have to attack and change the policies on the front end. We have to look at, for those who are confined, how we can give them adequate programming and assistance. And then when they're released, I'm going to say this to the listeners. I say this every day. And you can quote this. Khalil said, it's not only the person who is in the prison system's second chance, it's our second chance. It's the community's second chance for forgiveness, to have compassion, to have mercy, a second chance to allow a person to redeem themselves. Because if we don't get past that, if the community doesn't embrace its second chance, then that person coming out is most likely going to be isolated, not provided the resources and opportunities, and then enter right back into the system that most people say they want to dismantle, change, reform. And I say the only way you can do that is take away the money. So with that being said, it's always a pleasure to come and talk about these issues as they still play out in real time around us. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And again, as a reminder to our audience, if you have questions for Mr. Rashdan or for any of the presenters, be sure to share those in the comments for our upcoming Q&A period. Our last presentation of the evening is going to be on the system, law enforcement, judges, district attorneys, cash bonds, bails, etc. And that will be presented by Judge Carol Scott Berry. She is a retired Phoenix Municipal Court judge. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Public Administration from the University of Southern California and a Juris Doctorate from Arizona State University, Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. She is a member of the ASU Center for the Study of Race and Democracy Advisory Board, State Bar Task Force on Social Justice, Bias, and Inclusion. She has served on the Arizona Supreme Court Committee on the Impact of Domestic Violence in the Courts and the Phoenix Municipal Court Specialty Court Committee. Judge Berry is the recipient of several awards, including the Arizona Black Bar 2017 Cecil Patterson Community Service Award. In 2014, Judge Berry was one of 6 Arizona judges selected for entry in the Council on Legal Education Opportunity Hall of Fame. Welcome, Judge Berry.
Thank you. And good evening to all of you who are watching. As our moderator said, I am Judge Carol Scott Berry. I am retired. I have been retired now for about approximately 2 years. I have been an Arizona attorney for about 33 years. I began my practice here in Arizona as a public defender. And so I have been working in the system for the majority of that 33 years and seen a lot of changes, some good and some not so good. But I still think that despite all of the history that you've heard talked about and all of the history that things that are going on with us currently, that there is still room for hope. And hope is within each of us. Just the fact that you are here listening to these presentations shows that you have a desire to want to make change and you want to do something in the space that you've been given. And you have an opportunity to do that. The more we share our experiences, the more progress we can make toward justice for all. And I think most of Americans want justice for all. There is that misnomer that some people just want justice for themselves, but I think the times are showing that people want fairness. People just want to be fair, and I think we're in a space right now where we can act on that. And so the question becomes: so what needs to happen for every person, regardless of your ethnicity, your nationality, your gender, your disability, or your sexual identity, to receive justice? And what is justice? Justice is doing what is right and what is fair. We often disagree about what is right and what is fair. In my 20 years as a judge, I heard victims and their families ask for justice while defendants and their families ask for mercy. Are they separate? Is it separate to have justice and mercy? I believe we can have both. And I believe that if we work together, we can have that happen. Currently, some receive justice while others receive mercy based solely on their ethnicity or nationality. Statistics, and some of them you just heard by Mr. Rushdon, and government investigative reports continually show us that people of color are more likely to be stopped by the police, more likely to be charged with felonies, more likely to be sentenced to prison than white Americans. A recent study of judges revealed that judges of color are more likely to be overturned by appellate courts than their white counterparts. Study after study has produced results proving the existence of institutional racism in our United States criminal justice system. And some people question the word justice. Michelle Alexander, the writer of the new Jim Crow laws, she talks about the criminal injustice system because it's more unjust than it is just. So what do? Do we continue to withstand the dehumanization and the second-class treatment, or do we unite with those who are woke? And woke is a term used by the younger generation to people who are aware, have woke up and seen what's going on around them and want to do better and work toward justice for a whole. So I hope those of you who are listening today are listening because you want to do better. You want to see improvement. You're not only woke, but you're ready and ready to do something. And the injustices in the system toward people of color are now at the forefront. Every media outlet, television, cable, social media, radio, newspapers, and magazines are all talking about social justice. The murder of George Floyd, in the words of his daughter, changed the world. Many of those who thought discrimination and racism were in the past now realize that discrimination and racism were alive and well. People throughout the world are marching, protesting, yelling, wearing T-shirts, hanging banners, and painting streets because Black Lives Matter. Every day since George Floyd's murder, there's been a protest in the city of Phoenix. Times are changing. Major corporations are changing hiring practices and bringing in speakers and teachers on diversity and inclusion because they want to do better. Yes, there are those who mock or refuse to believe our stories and our truths about our lives. But these naysayers and oppositions and basically haters were present in the days of Moses, and they're going to be present today and in our future. But it's imperative that we ignore them, stay focused on what can be, and join with those who believe us and want to do better. When I first started practicing law, as I said, I worked as a public defender, and that was during the time of the do drugs, do time. And for whatever reason, the system had come down hard on drug users and not so much drug sellers. And so I would have clients who were charged with selling drugs, and they were nothing more than just users. Undercover officers would have these people go into a known crack house, give them money to buy drugs, and they would go in and buy the drugs, come out with the drugs, and all they wanted was a hit from the drug. And so they would give them that hit, and then later on charge them with selling drugs. They were accused of being drug dealers, and many of them went to prison for being a drug dealer, because if you did drugs, you didn't automatically go to prison. You were just charged with possession. But if you were a drug dealer, then you went to prison, and there was no end about it. That's how the law was written. That was the mandatory sentence for selling drugs, no matter the amount. If it was a huge amount, a larger amount, then it would become a larger sentence term. But you had these low-level drug users who all they wanted was a hit, and they were sent to prison. And it was a system that you felt helpless for, because most of these people that were going to prison were Black and brown people. There were some white people, but for the most part, and here in Arizona, that's alarming, because here in Arizona, at that time, we were only 4% of the population, but we were the majority of the prison population for drug selling. And one of the other things that stood out when I was a public defender was they decided that they were going to charge minors, violent minors, who they determined were violent, as adults. And so you had these 15, 16, 17-year-olds in the facility of the jail with all of these adults. And it was just the saddest situation to see. They had a separate unit for them, but still they were being guarded by the same guards and basically treated like they were adults. And I was fortunate enough to be able to have a good relationship with the probation department. And we worked closely and hard to make sure that most of these minors did not have to spend any more time in prison, that they were given opportunities to try to get their lives back together. But again, these were your Black and your brown individuals. One of my passions is encouraging students of color to pursue law. And the more lawyers that we have of color, hopefully, the better we will be represented in the system. Being a lawyer gives you a voice, and your position as a lawyer opens up rooms at the tables where decisions are being made that affect our lives. We need more people of color to become judges. In order to be a judge in Arizona, unless it's a justice of the peace, you have to be a lawyer. There's been a lot of progress, but the judiciary is still very white and very male. Statistics say the judiciary is 73% men and 80% white. We must agree that this is important to change this. Judges wield immense power. They make decisions that affect people's lives, well-being, and fundamental rights. They serve as a check on the executive and legislative branches. The balanced system is designed to ensure the lawmakers and the executive branch adhere to the United States Constitution and established laws. And so we need to be at those tables. We need to be on those benches. We need to be in those rooms making those decisions. It's important that we are participants in the court system, that when we are participants in the court system, either as victims, defendants, witnesses, or advocates, that we are speaking to judges who hear us and understand us. In 2017, the Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court made a presentation at Arizona Black Bar Seminar. He showed us the statistics of judicial appointments in Arizona over the last 10 years. He then looked at the number of students of color graduating from high school, college, law school, passing the bar, and becoming competent lawyers. He concluded if we keep doing the same things that we're doing, we'll never catch up. We need to do something different. There is not one solution. We can find solutions through so many different avenues. You don't have to wait and see if one solution doesn't work to invest in another one. First, we need hope. We must believe that we can do this, that we can have access to justice, and justice is possible for everyone. And secondly, it's my faith that we must trust in God's plan. We must believe that although it looks like things are falling apart, for God, everything is coming together. We're right where He wants us to be, and He'll work through us to bring about solutions. And lastly, we must be humbly excited to be a part of the solution. We can no longer be silent or reactionary. We're living in a different season now. Many are listening and want to talk now more than ever before. And we cannot let these opportunities pass us by. We must be proactive. We don't have all the answers, but working together with like minds can be progress. George Floyd's murder has caused Americans to try to educate ourselves on race, discrimination, and injustice. Some of us who are of color are getting kind of tired of those who are not, trying to educate them. But thank God that they're in a space now that they want to learn. And books on our life experiences, whether it's racism, Jim Crow, discrimination, being an anti-racist, are sold out on Amazon. So many are thirsting for knowledge and trying to learn more. I learned about slavery myself from watching the documentary or the drama Roots. I learned about Jim Crow laws in law school. My parents were from Arkansas and of a culture that you didn't talk about racism or discrimination. When we'd visit my grandparents and other relatives in the summer, I saw the segregated schools. I saw the Black school and I saw the white school, but I had no idea that they were government ordered. The Black school was larger than the white school. And I remember feeling sorry for this little white girl who was by herself sitting in a swing because she was alone and didn't have anybody to play with while all the other Black kids were out running around playing together. Recently, I did a presentation for ASU incoming freshmen. And the organizer of that presentation gave a little history of Blacks at ASU. And I learned that ASU, or Tempe, Arizona, in the 1920s had what was called Sundown Laws. And these Sundown Laws prohibited Black students or Black people from being outside after the sun went down. We always think of Jim Crow's laws and those type of laws being active in the South, but this was here in Arizona in the 1920s. Jim Crow laws gave us segregated restaurants, housing sections on buses, movie theaters, and water fountains, but there was no segregated courts. Black people were still subjected to the administration of justice by white people. They determined what was right, and we were still found to be inferior. Although the 14th Amendment was passed, the reasoning of the Dred Scott case and the Plessy v. Ferguson case that Mr. Brookins talked about, that reasoning was never overturned. The analysis that Black people were inferior has never been overturned. A pastor says, yes, Jim Crow is dead, but his grandchildren, great-grandchildren are still alive. But things are changing. A retired Maricopa Superior Court judge that I worked with at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office as a law clerk 30 years ago wrote an article recently in the opinion section of the Arizona Republic entitled, "I Was Raised to Be a Racist." Now, I had gone to lunch with this person almost every day during our time as law clerks, and all kinds of thoughts ran through my mind. She talked in her article about her upbringing and being oblivious to racism. But the George Floyd murder had caused her to look around and do better. After reading the article, I reached out to her, and she said she was so happy that I did. She started a website, It Takes Courage, where there is a dialogue and the sharing of information to do better. Other judges, lawyers have joined the conversation. She and I will do a presentation at the State Bar Convention in December entitled Illuminating Bias, Discrimination, and Racism. Michelle Alexander, in her new Jim Crow book, educated us and anybody who wants to read on the history and growth of mass incarceration. But COVID has brought about changes that protesters and marchers could never do. Nonviolent offenders are being released from jail and prison at rapid rates because of COVID. Police are not arresting people for minor offenses because of COVID. It makes you wonder if they could be released due to COVID, just maybe they should not have been incarcerated in the first place. In 2015, the U.S. Department, under the direction of U.S. Attorney Eric Holder, completed 2 investigations. One looked into the shooting of Michael Brown, and the second into the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department. The report concluded that there was no prosecutable claim against the officer, but there was a damning case against the system in which the officer worked. Ferguson's own data established clear racial disparities that adversely impacted African Americans in that community. Many officers appeared to see some residents, especially those who lived in Ferguson's predominantly African American neighborhoods, less as constituents to be protected than as potential offenders and sources of revenue. Focus on revenue was almost wholly a focus on Black people as revenue. Black people in Ferguson were twice as likely to be searched during the stop, twice as likely to receive a citation when stopped, and twice as likely to be arrested during the stop, and yet were 26% less likely to be found with contraband. Black people were more likely to see a single incident turn into multiple citations. The Justice Department found discriminatory intent, that is to say, willful racism, aimed to generate cash. The investigation found emails between Ferguson workers with a noose around President Obama's neck, all types of derogatory names, and there was never any reprimands for any of these emails or these comments. The officials, when asked about all of this, claimed that, Black people have a lack of personal responsibility. But the only investigation showed that that was not true. The investigation revealed that African Americans make extraordinary efforts to pay off their expensive tickets for minor, often unfair charges, violations, despite their obstacles. And while the investigation found no lack of personal responsibility among Black residents of Ferguson, it did find that the very same people making the charge were often busy expunging fines for their friends. They found email after email where elected officials or department heads were having tickets erased or dismissed or not seen by email. As a result of the Ferguson report, every court system in the county revised their system. In Phoenix, probably most of Arizona, people were being arrested and jailed for driving on a suspended license. Many of them arrested and jailed because they could not pay the fines and they could not get their driver's license reinstated. And this, of course, had a direct effect on poor people and people of color. Many would actually lose their vehicles because their license was suspended for failure to pay fines. Phoenix began with what's called the Compliance Assistance Program. And listening to Mr. Rajan had me really think about the naming of this, the Compliance Assistance Program. But what it was a way for people to get out of that vicious cycle of continually to get more citations on top of citations for suspended license and never been able to get their license and never been able to get from under the courts. And so it allowed people to get on the payment plan. And if they stayed current on the payment plan, which was established based on their income and the other things that they had to pay, whether their rent, mortgage, and those kind of things. And if they stayed current on that, they would the case would be dismissed. And the person was allowed, once they got on the payment program, they were allowed to get their driver's license back. And the joy that I would see on individuals who hadn't had a driver's license in 10 or 15 years, coming in, waving at me, Judge Berry, look, I got my license back, was just to see that burden and that relief that we had placed on our citizens, just because they were poor. If they could pay the fines, they would have paid them, but they couldn't. But this program gave them an opportunity to get from under that. And the Phoenix program has been adopted by other cities and won numerous awards. And the program even expanded to people who were living out of state, and they could do this telephonically. Also as a result of the Ferguson report, bail reform began. Courts began to default to release instead of bail. New bail standards were set and requiring bail in only the most serious cases. Now, very few people charged with misdemeanors are held on bond, and a small proportion are even held who are charged with felonies. We have our vice presidential nominee is a former prosecutor and a person of color. And there is a lot of skepticism on both sides. Because she was a former prosecutor, some people see her as promoting the mass incarceration, while others see her as a bridge. This is an opportunity to deal with these situations and have someone who's been on both sides to be able to come to the table and try to talk about some racial justice. And there's hope that if she does become vice president, we can have a national conversation about crime and punishment. There are several programs going on now where courts throughout the country are stepping up and leading the legal profession to eradicate racism. The New Jersey Supreme Court has created an action plan in which they plan to institute major changes within 1 year. Some of those is the way that jury selection and jury summons are handled and how people are called into jury duty. The way that probation terms are handed out. Why does somebody have to be on probation for 3 years? Are we setting them up for failure? Or are we just waiting for them to be sent to prison? And so they're looking at that and coming up with new ways of dealing with the system and trying to make it better. The courts are requiring that attorneys and judges attend mandatory implicit bias training and racism training. And Arizona is working on a similar plan. And I'm fortunate to be a part of that, working with the Arizona Supreme Court on that plan. So we, as woke people, we want to stay woke. And we don't want to let anybody else go back to sleep. And we never want to get tired of doing what's right or trying to do what's good. So we want to continue unifying and working with those who want to work with us and holding people accountable for their actions. I know it can be exhausting, but we have no choice but to speak up and call it out. We saw recently in the news that one of the grand jurors from the Breonna Taylor case petitioned the court so he could tell what really happened in that grand jury. And now we learn that they were never presented with charges for homicide, and they only were presented with the charges with which they came back. So we have to continue to speak up and been given to make change. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Judge Barry. And I'm going to invite all of the panelists back to screen now as we launch right into some of our questions and answers. The first question is an audience question for any of the panelists. And the question was stated, as I understand it, the Second Chance Act was supported by a majority of Arizonans, but under pressure from several powerful prosecutors was vetoed by Governor Ducey. What is the current status of this bill, and can it be passed in the future?
So I'll take that. The Second Chance Act was actually a ballot initiative. It was part of, I forget the longer name of it, and forgive me for that, but it was part of a ballot initiative that never made it to the ballot. It was actually undermined by the county recorder and prosecutor Barbara Lawal down in Tucson. Now, when we talk about other bills that were introduced at the legislative session to address earned release credits, to address, right now, judges, and the judge could elaborate on this, but prosecutors have become the most powerful people inside of the system because they've taken away judicial discretion. So there were bills introduced to take away judicial discretion. There was a bill that was introduced called Hannah Pryor's, where prosecutors, they could use one. So you've never been in trouble. They can use one of your charges as a prior to put you in a different sentencing category. So there's a lot of games that are played when it comes to prosecution and incarceration, and we introduced several bills. However, Hannah Priors didn't make it out of our legislators onto Ducey's desk. He vetoed that one. The rest of them were really undermined by different people who say they want reform. However, behind the scenes, they were working to undermine any efforts to bring change to this crisis we have here, and it is a crisis in Arizona. Sorry about that.
No, you're good. Thank you so much for answering that. Any other thoughts on that question?
I just want to explain a little more what Hannah Priors are. And Hannah is the name of a case that was decided some decades ago that allows a prosecutor to charge you as a second time, third time offender based on the number of convictions that you had in the past. But Hannah takes that further and says that if you're charged with several counts in the same complaint and the same indictment, meaning, let's say you're charged with theft and you're also charged with burglary, if you're convicted of both of those, even though that's probably out of the same event, you're treated as a second time offender. And so, and as we know, that type of discretion places our people more in prison than others. Because if you're a second time offender, you're not eligible for probation. You're going straight to prison, no matter what your record is. So if you have more than one count in a complaint or an indictment, then you're treated as a second, third time, depending on how many counts you have and how many counts you are found guilty of as that many time a felon. And prosecutors use that to basically to get people to plead guilty, because that makes people look at more. They're looking at more time. And so, and you tell, as a public defender, and I tell somebody how much time they're looking at, a plea agreement starts to look good. And so they use that to basically to get people to take plea agreements. And I don't believe that's what it was intended for, but that's how it's been used.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to come right back to you, Judge, with a question. We often hear the argument that the prison system is the new system of slavery in America. Do you agree with this statement, and to what extent?
I don't know if it's new, because if you know the history of our prison system, this has been going on for centuries. Even after emancipation, laws were made that we couldn't walk on the side of the sidewalk at a certain time. If we dropped our gum, then you get a citation. You can't pay the citation, and you go into prison. And they use that prison labor as free labor. And so this is not new. And it's always been about money. And that's basically what our prison system has been built on.
Thank you. Mr. Rushdan, we are very well versed in America on the idea of the evils of things like forced labor and slave labor in other countries. Yet very much so, your presentation also noted the contradiction between for-profit contracts held by prison or by private prisons and the labor of prisoners who don't even earn minimum wage. Would you liken this system to slave labor, and what do you think needs to change within that system?
Well, just touching on what the judge just said, the system is labor, period. The only thing is I talked about how people like to dress it up, and like you have the incarcerator leading reform efforts. You see what I'm saying? So it's like the wolf dressing up in sheep's clothing, saying, "Hey, I'll be the guard dog," for that matter, saying, "I'll watch the hen." But in the instance where you're absolutely right, where I said some of the individuals in the prison become consumers, other individuals become labor because there will never be enough jobs for those who are in prison. So what they try to do is they try to use a classification system on who could be released into the community versus who can take internal jobs. So you might have a guy raking rocks or picking up cigarette butts for 10 cents an hour, or working in the kitchen, washing dishes. Some people have what they call ACI jobs, which is a whole nother presentation. I tell people to look it up. So Department of Corrections split itself into a whole separate entity, which it calls Arizona Correctional Industries, which employs people. They take outside contracts. The biggest piece of that is people always now we can talk about what how it impacts other countries, because I do think a lot of migrants get a bad label of them taking our jobs, and then you get this fear mongering from certain people who say, well, we don't want migrants in our country because they're taking our jobs, and I have to tell them, no, your job is going right down the street to the prison. So it's all built on labor. You just have to track it, because it's going to keep morphing to where it's not a solution. It just becomes more covert.
Thank you. Mr. Brookins, the idea of controlling, one of the things that you talked about was the idea of controlling Black people in America systemically. And early in your presentation, you noted that every attempt on the part of Black Americans to pursue freedom and justice has historically been seen as criminal. How do we continue to see those controls in place systemically in our modern society? And is the American concept of Black people historically and modernly linked to that idea of criminalization?
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about is it linked, I think Black criminality is always going to be linked to our attempt for liberation, right? Because when you look at the narrative, there's a great book. I can't remember the author right now, but it's called The Black Image and the White Mind. And it takes you through this journey of scientists during those times and politicians through those times, and how they painted this glowing image of Black people during the height of slavery, right? That we were such a loving people, such a docile people, right? But as the talks of abolition movement rise, as the talks of liberation rise, then they started to paint this image of us being childlike, being immature, irrational, right? Quick to anger, because it was a saying, see, they need us. They need our guidance. They need our supervision. Because without that, they'll run, amok, So as the judge, Madam Judge, shared, once we were freed, then there was that implementation of Black codes. And just to think about it, like, just like common sense wise, once Black people were freed from slavery, where can they go? They're not native to this land. They don't own any property. So they wander the streets because they're now homeless. And Black codes were implemented saying, if we caught 3 or more Black people gathered together wandering the streets during work hours, that was grounds for imprisonment, and which led to, them being convicts, and then led to the term of convict leasing, right? In which slave owners then paid the prison system for their labor on that plantation that they just got freed from. So it was always this plot to put Black people back within the control of a superior or an overseer, right? I like the term when someone's KRS-One says, say overseer super fast, It goes from overseer, officer, right? You start to hear the similarities within even that language itself, right? So this is just the leverage and the history and how it's been manifested, right? It's not that racism has ended, it's evolved, right? iPhone 1 doesn't look like iPhone 10 or iPhone 12 that's about to come out. They added some improvements, they took some bugs out, they made it run smoother. That way you can't see quite the issues, so instead of your screen freezing when you try to load something, now you get that little circle that spins, right? And it's the same thing. It's still frozen. It's not working right now, but it appears to operate and function differently. And that's the essence that I think that we are all trying to explain, is that it's only evolved and it's become less apparent to the eye, which, bringing back to, Madam Judge and both Rushdown, it's important to understand, to remain woke and aware, because it's getting harder. It's getting harder to sift through and to understand those points. So yeah, that's my answer. I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Mr. Rushdown, first question, and it's actually leading into a couple questions back to back. So I'll just start with this first one. Can you tell us more about recidivism programming, first of all?
So, at the core, and I break this down to the basics. Recidivism was tracked. I was released December 20 of 2011, came back to Arizona. So about 2013, when I was interacting with community organizations, colleges, things like that, it was more like, I describe it as corrections waiting at the door saying, oh, you didn't show up today. You didn't show up this year. So to me, recidivism was just tracked based on who went back to prison at what time. To me, that was a big disservice, because recidivism by its fifth year here in Arizona, recidivism was tracked over a 20-year period. Year 1 through 5, and this is based on, there was a report that was released by prosecutors who compiled numbers from correction itself. By year 5, recidivism was at like 40, I think it was 47% or something like that. I forget the exact number. But between year 4 and 5, it only grew like 10%. So it topped out, actually, I think it topped out at 50.7%. Reason I'm saying that is because from year 5 to 20, it was only a 10% recidivism chance. So if you made it over your first 5 years, you had a better chance to succeed. The problem was, what is the quality of that person's reentry? Just because a person never went back to the system doesn't mean they were stable. You see what I'm saying? The person could have been homeless, just arrested, never, and they might have made it past that 5th year. So when we look at recidivism and how it's tracked, we really need to dig in. And this is a whole community effort. And I'll be honest, that's not just on the system. That's on everyone involved, the community, faith-based organizations. Everybody has to get involved with that. So to me, the numbers are not accurate. We could have a whole workshop on recidivism, but everything in a nutshell, that's just how it was tracked, based on a person returning to the system. And if they violated, if they were on parole or probation and violated, versus new charges.
Thank you very much. For this next question, this is really for you and Judge Barry. And it's a big one because it's happening right now. We want to talk about Proposition 207. which is the current marijuana proposition on the Arizona ballot. It's promising to expunge records, but in Arizona, there's no way to actually do that. So can either of you talk more about this specific proposition, what it's actually doing, who it serves, how it would actually be enforced, or what that looks like?
You want to start, Judge, or you want me to? Okay. So 207, first off, prior to 207, I'm totally against the criminalization of marijuana. Me, myself, I don't smoke it. But as a case manager, I seen how it played out firsthand. Okay. So when 207 came along because it was forced into the hands of the voters, because there were several people trying to have legislative fixes or try to get county attorneys not to prosecute for low-level marijuana offenses and low-level drugs. So we can talk about Sheila Polk in Yavapai County, who was one of those county attorneys who actually prosecuted an individual for having, I think it was edibles or oils or something to that nature. This was about 2 years ago. It was a big case. So when you look at 207 and the expungements of records and things like this, it's no surprise to me, and there's a lot of misinformation going out because these are things that should be going on. And if the voters pass it, and that's part of that ballot, the language of that initiative, and the voters pass it, the only way that they wouldn't be able to expunge records is if it goes to the Supreme Court and it's challenged. You see what I mean? Which we have to go back to Red for Ed, and parts of Red for Ed that was invalidated by the Supreme Court. So when you look at 207, I'm looking at it will take a lot of criminalization away from what I deem as a culture. Our youth, a lot of Black and brown youth smoke marijuana. And the way it plays out for our youth, their first charge, and Judge, you may see this a lot of their first charges are low-level possession charges. And then, later on in life, they may have gotten their life straight in college, and then they get another BS charge that's going to derail their career. And these low-level drug offenses, these marijuana offenses, become life sentences because they will hinder you in Arizona from moving forward for stable employment in a career or stable housing. So those elements of 207, I do support. And, there's other elements that I'm kind of up in the air. But when people run around, talk about impaired drivers and things like that, I'm saying, well, when you look at alcohol and the legalization of alcohol and impaired drivers, I don't see a bigger risk by legalizing marijuana. That's my opinion. That's not the ACLU or that's my opinion in being on the ground in the community. There are many other risk factors that we should be considering. However, I think it's against the interest to keep it, as a criminal offense, because there are several people making money off of it. I hope that answered. I was looking for a fact sheet. I got a one-pager fact sheet on it too.
Well, I guess I don't know where to start, but it's so many issues coming into play in that, because Arizona has gone from medical marijuana, and now we're now at the medical marijuana card, and now we're talking about recreational marijuana. And you have fear mongers, as if this becomes the law, that we're going to have a bunch of people laying out on the streets with needles in their arms or whatever it may be, with druggies, despite the fact that we already do. That's already the case. And the courts, in response to the medical marijuana card, has been really hard. And I've had driving under the influence cases, driving under the influence of drug cases, where prosecutors are arguing that the person can't bring in their card. The fact that they have not been charged with possession of marijuana because they have the card. And so they want to let the jury know that I had this marijuana legally, even though that's not the issue in the trial. And the prosecutors are arguing they can't bring the card in. And it's kind of like, why? Because you want the jury to believe that this person is a drug user and a legal drug user. And it's like, why do you want to do that to people? But on the same token, you do have people who need marijuana for medical purposes. And it does not make any sense at all to stop someone who is hurting, who is sick, who is in pain, or whatever it may be, from not having something that's available. All because you can't put a price on it, or you can't find a way to sell it, and those kind of things. And so all of these issues are coming into play. The courts several years ago came up with what is called drug court. And what that is, if you just charged with possession of drugs, meaning you're a drug user, not a drug dealer, not selling drugs, then you have the opportunity to, if you go to counseling and go to treatment as they prescribe, then you can have your case dismissed. And it's had some success because it's what we call therapeutic courts, meaning we're trying to deal with the problem. We're not just saying you're guilty and locking you up and throwing away the key. We're actually trying to deal with the situation at hand. And there's been a lot of success in drug courts, and they're all across the country where there are drug courts. But on the same token, when you're talking about a conviction on your record, that's different. In Arizona, possession of marijuana is a felony. In a lot of other states, it's a misdemeanor, but in our state, it's a felony. So if you are going through drug court and you don't complete it for whatever reason, you just don't do it. You don't want to do it, or you don't have the money, whatever it may be. You don't do it, then you're a felon. And as Mr. Rashonda said, it precludes you from basically life. You can't get a good job. You can't get housing. You can't vote. I mean, for the most part, being a felon, basically you are isolated from society until that felony is removed. There are means that are available, but most people are not aware of that. The state bar is starting to put on programs throughout the state with lawyers volunteering to help people to clean up their records, to have convictions set aside. And there are certain things people have to do to have them set aside, but it can be done. And it has to be a certain period of time, has to have lapsed and no other convictions and those kind of things, but that can be done. But in the meantime, in between time, you get to that point, what are you doing? You're a felon. You can't get a good job. You can't buy food. You can't have a place to stay. All of those kind of things, you're precluded from society. And so you end up, as Mr. Rashan was talking about, going back to prison. You end up going to prison because you can't function because you're a felon. And so if you can stop that at the onset and somehow either decriminalize it or make it a lower level offense as a misdemeanor or something to that effect, you have a better success for your society, because this is really not just a drug user's problem. This is a community problem because our taxes, we're paying for this incarceration. We're paying for this probation. We're paying for this parole. We're paying for all of this stuff. And if we able to nip it in the bud at the front end, we have somebody who's also paying. Now we have a person that's contributing to society. He's taking care of his family, taking care of himself, and contributing to society. So you have to look at I think just the big picture of what it is, and not so much, I don't want to legalize it because, as somebody said, it was a fight to legalize alcohol. But somehow or another, we got it. And nobody has ever come back and said, let's decriminalize, let's criminalize drinking alcohol. So that's just my thoughts.
Well, thank you both. For our last question of the evening, I want to go back to something that you said, Judge Berry, during your presentation, which was just about the importance of maintaining hope. I think that's such an important thing as part of this conversation, because obviously I think what we've learned is that there is a lot that needs to be fixed and a lot that needs to be changed in order to ensure that our criminal justice system really is a justice system. So for all of the presenters, I'd like us to close with just each of your thoughts on what specifically reform looks like within the criminal justice system and what needs to happen to fix the system.
Who did you want to start?
Let's start with Mr. Brookins.
Okay. I can always, because I look to people for hope, right? And the figure that I started off with, James Baldwin, has a great quote as well, saying, "Not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." So that's important, framework to think of, when you think about, fighting these battles. And also just the aspect of something that Maya Angelou said in the regards that we, meaning, the generations of now and the generations of the future, we're our ancestors' greatest dreams, right? They endured hellish environments for us to be in this position that we are now. So it's important, that we keep moving that needle, one, because it's understanding the hopes and dreams, right, that they instilled in us and that they went through for us to be in this place. And now that we are in a position, even though the margin of error is so small, right, we are in a position to have that impact and have that change. And I know I'm pushing it now, but, of the big piece when we talk about MLK and all of the people with SNCC pushing the Voting Rights Act was a part of having our say and our voice, within political participation. We understand this system was not meant for us, but it is a tool that we can use effectively to impact change. So come November 3rd, and hopefully beforehand, so they don't try to pull anything, right? Go in there and, share your perspective on what you think needs to be happening moving forward. And do not stop with your voice, because your voice matters. And if anything, it's even more essential because of what you've been through.
Thank you. Mr. Rushdan.
So, change has to come from community, and change starts with a level of accountability. But the biggest part of that accountability, as I tell individuals, my biggest fight is to reduce our prison population, and we can safely do that without the fear of jeopardizing the so-called public safety. When you look at all the statistics, all the data, which we hear people always talking about, we want data. Well, all the data says crime overall over the last couple of decades has gone down, although our prison populations remain high. So I want to really try to build relationships, authentic relationships with community. There's division because people don't communicate, and they let the BS drive wedges between us. where we used to take pride in what came out of our mouth. We knew what you would take pride in telling truth and stating fact. Now we let a lot of misinformation guide us. And I always say, I've gone into the reddest areas. I don't care about the politics. I've gone into the reddest areas and talked to people. I told them, hold your tomatoes, because a lot of them don't like the ACLU. But the reality of it is, it's like where I'm not having these conversations, somebody is. And, your average person goes out, works, they come home, they just want to live in peace, take care of their family. And, on both sides of the fence, we have instigators. And that's where, the change comes when we can build those authentic relationships, create spaces for people to come in and start building those relationships so they can talk about it and start implementing solutions instead of having somebody that's very knowledgeable and identifying the problem, spend 40 years being an expert on the problem. But and I say there's no such experts in the work that I do, because people call me an expert. I'm not an expert, because I'm going to sum it up with this. This is a living, breathing system. If you're not consistently connected to it, it will change on you from week to week, month to month, year to year. So in order to implement solutions, we have to slow it down, and we have to start applying those real-time solutions. If not, that solution then becomes outdated. And what good is a sandwich for somebody today if they're hungry yesterday? So thank you, guys. I appreciate you having me here tonight.
Thank you. Judge Berry.
I think hope looks like, as Mr. Rashad said, accountability and using your voice in your space. We all have a space that we're in, that we've been placed in, and it's not for us to be silent, to say, I have mine, that's not me. It's for us to speak up. And I think part of our problem has been that we have been trained to take certain things and to accept that to be that's just how it is. But what we're seeing now with this woke generation is, no, it does not have to be that way. I can stand up and I have a voice and I have a right to be heard just like anybody else. And I have a right to be at that table now where you're making these decisions about things that affect me. And it's interesting because even with Martin Luther King, he was young at that time. And it's always been the young people who have stepped up. And that's what we see now. We see our young people taking the streets, protesting, saying that their lives matter. And they're being joined by people all throughout the world saying that their lives matter. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope that there's a possibility for change. And everybody is never going to be on board. That's just how it is. There's some people that live in today that still wish that we were in slavery, but that's just how it is. And so you can't worry about those people who don't want to get on board. You just leave them behind. And as President Obama said, maybe they just have to die off. There's nothing else we can do but wait for them to die. But there's hope in the fact that there is a whole momentum going on in our country for change. And we cannot let that pass us by, that we need to be active. We need to be using our voice in the space that we're in and changing the community that we're in. And some of the things also is that everybody wants to talk. Nobody wants to listen. And so sometimes it takes just listening, that we have biases as well. And so we are already presuming certain things about certain people, and that might not be the case. We need to take time, sit down and talk with the person, see where they're coming from, because they don't support this or they don't support that. They have a reason for that. And it's not always that they're racist or they are or prejudiced. They just have a feeling about whatever, and they have a right to have that feeling. And so there has to be mutual respect between us as human beings. And that get back to that point where we respect each other as human beings and use our voices in the spaces that we're in, because there's hope. There's hope for change, because as we see from our history, there's been a lot of change, even though there's a lot more to come.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your presentations, for your thoughts, your answers to questions, and for your engagement with our community. And thank you to the community of Flagstaff who tuned in and listened with us this evening. Part of doing the work that we're talking about is being engaged, educating yourselves, listening, learning, and then going out and finding ways to make positive changes within the community after you have been educated to the need for it. So we appreciate you joining us week after week, and we invite you to come back and join us again on November 4th for our next session on redlining the American dream. This session will focus on structural racism, redlining practices, including the ongoing affordable workforce housing versus NIMBYism conversation, and the American dream of home ownership. We look forward to seeing you with us again next time. We thank those of you who joined us this evening and those who will be rewatching, sharing this out to your networks, and continuing in this conversation with us. Ms. Bernadine?
Here I am. Good discussion tonight. I said it was going to be a hot topic, and I kind of felt like we would go over. I'd like to thank our audience who was diligent and stayed and hung in there with us. We do these lived Black experience community dialogue. It's a project. We do this to educate, inform, and enlighten. And so as we come to the end of the evening, and I'm already beginning to reflect on the words of all of our panelists, we indeed are the dream and the hope of the slave. And I'm sitting here remembering my grandmother, who was the product of she was the first freed child out of slavery, but she would talk about voting and voting tests in the South. And I'm remembering 3 of the questions for some reason that really stayed in her memory. One being, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, a straight pin? How many blades of grass that was on the courthouse? And then how many bubbles in a bar of soap? If these questions were not answered correctly, then you were not allowed to vote. And so, as you can imagine, how many people who look like us on this screen this evening were turned away from the opportunity to vote. So yes, it is very important to get out and vote. And indeed, all of the ancestors that are represented on this screen this evening paid some sort of price through blood, sweat, and or tears. We are very humbled to be here, to have these discussions, to have the space, and we thank the audience, particularly our European American brothers and sisters who join in on this conversation. We've said it before, and we'll say it as many times as we have to. We are looking for accomplices, not allies. And so that is why we do these bi-weekly broadcasts and hot topics. Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. Be blessed, stay healthy and strong. Power to all people, and we'll see you again week after next.